As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
The bottom line there is that whatever you take a drug to do, and with addictive drugs, we take them to create a sense of meaning, the brain produces the exact opposite effect. And so the net effect is neutral. And that's why we get tolerant, so the drug doesn't work so well because the brain is counteracting it. That's why we're dependent, because when we take the drug away, we've got this lower baseline now to kind of keep things even. And that's why we crave drugs and go to any length and, pay a high price, sometimes with our lives, because of tolerance and dependence.
That was Judith Grisel on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are three clinical psychologists here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas from psychology to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act Daily Journal, the Act Daily Card Deck, and the upcoming book, Act for Burnout.
I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, a Boston-based clinical psychologist, assistant professor at Brown University, and author of the book Work, Parent, Thrive.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, the Big Book of Act Metaphors, and the upcoming Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hi, everyone. Today we are here to talk to you about addictions. I have a really fascinating guest today, Dr. Judith Grisel. She's the author of a book called Never Enough, The Neuroscience and Experience of Addiction. And I'm here with Yael today to introduce the episode. And I'll just say that part of the reason this book was fascinating, as was my conversation with her, in part because she is a truly renowned expert on the science of addictions, and she really did a nice job of explaining it in a way that is really interesting and makes a lot of sense. And not only that, but she herself has a lived experience of addiction. She had a really serious addiction when she was younger, and she turned that ship around for herself and went through a process of sobriety and recovery and went on to become truly a renowned expert in the field of addictions. And so you get to hear both what it was like, her personal experience and her own thoughts around living with addiction, and then also some of the research-based science of addiction. And so to me, it was a really fascinating combination. Yael, what did you think about the conversation?
I loved it. It really was powerful for exactly the reason that you're describing. And I do think that when we're talking about addiction, getting the more personal side of it helps to destigmatize it. And there is so much stigma. And I was really glad that you guys addressed that head on, and that she was able to kind of use her own story to help to destigmatize and demoralize what is often a condition that we have a lot of judgment around. I talked about this a lot with Dr. Carl Eric Fisher, who similarly had his own struggle with addiction that prompted him to write his book, The Urge. So that was episode 235. And also there's so many great episodes that we've had that have similar themes, and the addiction inoculation with Jess Leahy, which is episode 202. And that kind of brings me to one quote that I absolutely loved from this episode, was where she said, drugs aren't good or bad. It's the way we use them. And for me, this really speaks to this core construct of psychological flexibility that we talk about a lot on this podcast, which is, it's not, most things are not dichotomously good or bad. There's usually some good to be had and some challenge to be had. It's really more about our relationship with things like alcohol or drugs or chocolate cake or Netflix, and that we can recognize that these things that feel good in the moment our vices may have some bad qualities to them if we use them in really rigid ways, but that we can give ourselves permission and explore ways to use them in more flexible, healthier ways. And that approach helps us to be more open and flexible with ourselves and with others, to reduce our judgment, and that we can look at it as an opportunity to figure out how do we help ourselves or people we love develop healthier relationships with things that can, when we use them in more rigid ways, be quite unhealthy.
Yeah, absolutely. And this, ever since I read this book and had this conversation with her, it has come to mind in so many situations, just how I'm thinking about the world, conversations I'm having with clients and with people in my personal life, where there's just these little nuggets of it that come in. And I was thinking, behaviorally, all the co-hosts on this podcast have a bit of a behavioral orientation to our work. And I think a lot about, okay, function, how's it working? But then also like, what's reinforcing about a behavior? What are the consequences of the behavior in terms of, is this a problem for you? Is this working? And one of the things she talked about is how sometimes that drive to acquire the substance, to use the substance, almost overrides the negative consequences. And in some cases, the negative consequences can be severe, but it gets to this place where people don't even care that much. And I can think of that on a low level in my own life sometimes, where I'm doing something and I know this isn't really good for me, but there's this part of myself that's like, in this moment, I really want this thing and I don't care. And I think we all probably have had that experience at some time, but I think it can get to the point where it's really a big problem in people's lives. It can be really costly with the things that matter most to people, their relationships, their work, just being able to have a healthy life. And that's where it's really sad and can be a really big problem.
Yeah, it kind of gets to this cognitive bias that everybody has, but to varying degrees, which is that we tend to overvalue the costs and consequences of the present moment more than the future. And I believe there's research showing that people who are more predisposed or more vulnerable for addiction have that to an even stronger level. In other words, that they are more likely to discount the future costs and more likely to emphasize the current gains of whatever might feel good in the moment. But you're right, Debbie, we all have that to some extent. That's a part of the way human brains work. And I think that's a super important thing to recognize, that it makes sense, right? And Jill often says that, like, we do something because it works for us. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it. And that in the moment, something can work for us, even though it doesn't work for us in the long run. And that can be a part of what is really self-perpetuating in an addictive cycle. It also brings to mind some of the research that I used to be really heavily involved in, which was studying couples treatments for substance use. And what we know is that couples treatments for things like alcohol abuse are really effective, except when both partners are engaged in excessive use, because it's like a shared activity. And as you were saying, like, the consequences, the reinforcing pieces of using as something that helps the relationship along, helps you enjoy one another more, make it less likely that a couple's intervention would work, because neither person is willing to give it up. Whereas if one person is not struggling with an addiction, but one person is, there's more consequences in the immediate future for the person who's using. For example, a lot of partners might say, I'm going to leave you unless you work towards becoming sober. And that isn't always motivational, but it is certainly more motivational than somebody who's using alongside you.
I remember a conversation you had back in episode 101 where you talked about addictions within the family system and within relationships, and, that situation where maybe you have a partner or a family member that you love and care about, and you're watching them go through some really problematic addiction behaviors and you don't know what to do. And I think that there's some talk about that in this conversation as well.
Yeah, I hope that people listen all the way to the end, because you ask her what are things that we can do, what are practical things that we can begin to do to make it easier to help people that we care about and help the world that, that is facing rising trends in substance use disorders. And she offers some really helpful advice.
Well, there's a lot of food for thought in this conversation, and it's a really interesting one. So we hope you enjoy taking a listen. Dr. Judith Grisel is a behavioral neuroscientist and professor of psychology at Bucknell University with expertise in pharmacology and genetics, whose research focuses on determining root causes of drug addiction. She's published widely in academic journals and the popular press, and her book that we're here to talk about today is called Never Enough: The Neuroscience and Experience of Addiction. She researches sex differences in the role of stress and endorphins on drug reward and works to identify innate factors that contribute to individual differences in the liability toward addiction. Welcome, Judy. I'm so glad that you're here with us today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, it's very exciting for me to talk to you because I think your book is phenomenal. I actually have to say, one thing I loved about your book, I often have looked at books on addiction and the brain science behind addiction. As a clinician, it's important for me to know a little bit about that and find them, a little bit dry to read. Your book is so fascinating. It's really amazing. And one of the things about it that I think is really interesting is that you're so open about your own personal history. And I think you're in a unique position to be writing about this because you have some learned experience with substance abuse and addiction, as well as, top-notch scientific training and the research background in addiction. So it's really pretty amazing to read. I think it's rare to find someone who has that level of experience in both of those areas. I mean, honestly, you also tell some really fascinating, kind of wild stories from your past that many are very sad, and also some are just very interesting, I think, to read. And so I was wondering if I could ask you to start out by talking a little bit about your thoughts about what drug and alcohol use did for you on kind of a psychological level. We'll get to the brain stuff later. But, and as a behavioral psychologist, we talk a lot about how behaviors sometimes that don't seem to make a lot of sense on the surface, there's something reinforcing going on, right? So for you, could you just say a little bit about why you ended up kind of in the situation you were in back when you were using?
Sure. One of the things I noticed before I kind of dredged back the past, my ideas of addiction and what it is from an academic perspective, but also what it is for me, are constantly being revised. And I think that's the field in general. It's just hard to put your finger on behavioral disorders. So today, I see that my addictions really came from a feeling of being lost and lacking meaning and connection with myself and with other things in life. And so I didn't realize exactly that people talk about this all the time, that they have like a hole in their soul or something. So I don't know what that is, but I do know that the first time I got my hands on alcohol, and I would say, it happened for the reason that it usually happens, which is just random chance, coupled with probably a bit of a risk-taking personality. So I got my hands on it. It was transformative. It really changed the trajectory of my life. And I think at that moment, I was 13. I was so insecure. I was, kind of full of my coming self or coming into myself, and also scared to death and feeling overwhelmed by that. And so it was like an antidote to everything. It made things bright and wonderful, and also soothed all the rough edges. So I think that was really the time that it got turned on. And the rest of it was just the sequelae of chasing that feeling.
Yeah. And again, we'll get a little bit more into the brain science later, and also your decision to stop using and go to school and learn everything you could about this area. We'll get to that as well. But I guess I'm just curious. So you've been clean and sober for quite a long time now. And do you still face some of that? I think because part of stopping the pattern is that you have to face some of those inner demons, I guess.
Yes. Oh, yes. Well, I think partly I'm grown up and I have an identity, and I've kind of faced and learned about myself and created myself as part of becoming an adult person. So it's not sort of the same triggers. However, I would say that being sober at this point in my life, I'm about to turn 60, been clean for 37 years, I think, in a little bit. And so it is both, it's really rich. I guess that's a good way to say it. It's full of amazing wonder and joy and travesty, of course, but also sometimes lonely, sometimes fraught with, frustration. I was just actually giving a toast, holding a glass of champagne at a party, and I was just worn out. It was kind of the end of a long week. And I happened to be the one who had to give this toast. And I usually hold a glass of water, but I was just so tired that I thought, I don't know, I felt less fragile. But I was thinking, this isn't really where I want to be. This isn't really what I want to be doing. So it's not a walk in the park, but it's much more interesting. It's much more open-ended and fulfilling than using was for me.
Yeah, that's well put. This state of being allows you to experience it all. And sometimes it is hard and there's nothing to blunt that effect for you. But that's
Exactly.
also the great thing about it, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I hear people sometimes use this term. They say, I have an addictive personality. When people say that, I'm always a little skeptical and also a little bit like, what does that mean exactly? But after reading your book, I think there might be a little something to it in the sense that there are certain factors that might predispose someone to get an addiction, right? Some people can use moderately or just once in a while, or it's just they're not interested. And other people, it's like really much more of a struggle. Could you, and I know this is a complicated one, right? This is not a simple, people are still researching this, but what are some of the factors that contribute to being high risk for an addiction?
Yeah, so I think there are three main streams for that. The first is genetic liability, and about half of the risk comes from what we inherit. And some of those factors are related to our personality, which, as you know, is pretty stable throughout our life. So being a risk taker, being high in novelty seeking, being kind of low in harm avoidance. I like to say that people who are kind of genetically prone tend to be people who are really motivated by carrots and not at all deterred by sticks. And that was me in a nutshell, and still kind of is. I really am just drawn to, what's possible out there that might be tasty. So I think that's a big part of it. The other half really is environmental, and a big portion of that is, like I said, random noise and access and family environment, and I didn't say all that, but culture. But the biggest part is using when you're an adolescent. And so I think the fact that my personality, my tendency to kind of say, oh, sure, what the heck, I'll do that. I can remember being, 4 or 5, and I would be the one who would jump out of the tree or climb up to the top of the tree, or just that what the heck kind of thing, which is still a part of me. I don't kind of like to play it safe. I think that combined with this random idea at a friend's house and, the half gallon of wine really lit the fire.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I really appreciated the personal aspect of your book, writing about your own experience, is that it came across as very non-judgmental. That there's not a lot of moralizing in it. You help it make sense that this can happen to all kinds of people. And one of the pieces of it is that repeated early exposure, right? But it's not, I mean, I think often people, tell me if you agree about this, people look at it as this kind of moral weakness or like, quote, bad behavior. But I think that you make the point that that's not really what's going on here. I like that framework. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I could say a lot about it. I think you'll probably have to stop myself, or you'll have to stop me. I think that, drugs aren't good or bad, obviously. I think it's the way we use them. And one of the things that I've learned is that people don't start out at the same place with that. People who suffer trauma, for instance, early, find drugs especially helpful in a way. And I think some of those people probably wouldn't survive if they couldn't escape a little bit or mitigate a little bit. That wasn't my experience, but I do think we don't all find it equally fun. Some people don't like the feeling of being out of control. I relish the feeling of being out of control. I still do. So that kind of takes the moral part out of it. I think that it's a confusing thing for all of us because certainly I made choices that were harmful to myself and other people. But nobody is perfect. And those choices were kind of weighted by these proclivities that I was born with. And I think that is really the case. And I think we're seeing as the tendency to struggle with substances goes up and up and up, that more and more people are suffering. So in that way, it's like being on an island that's shrinking. We can't really look at it like us and them, because eventually the water's going to be up around all our necks. There's also a lot of ways to use. So drugs were my way, but people use with work, or they use with social media, or they use with, binge watching TV. I mean, there's all kinds of escape. And the escape that worked so well for me and many others is drugs, because they're really potent and pretty reliable, at least at the beginning. But I think that all of us struggle to show up for things as they are.
Yeah, you make the point throughout the book several times about alcohol and how it's so kind of socially embedded in our culture that it becomes a very fine line. Where is it problematic? And when you have this large percentage of the population using it in socially acceptable ways, but then there's other substances or, alcohol where people go a little too far with it, and then all of a sudden it's a problem. So it's sort of interesting because there's all kinds of things we use that are considered fine.
Yeah, well, alcohol is actually a perfect illustration of this, because when I was writing the book, I believed that low dose alcohol, so just moderate use, was fine, maybe even beneficial. So the research on that is pretty clear now. It does not help anybody with anything. Even a drink a week has a measurable detrimental effect on your well-being, your physical health. I mean, it increases the risk for cancer and heart disease. It's kind of amazing. So let's just go back, 40 years, where people would say, oh, this poor person under the bridge. I'm so glad, that I drink my alcohol in pretty glasses and in front of the fire or whatever, right before dinner, or, in a good way. But if you look at the science of alcohol, it's a toxin. It's a toxin for everybody, no matter what you drink. Now, if you can drink less, it's certainly better than drinking more, but there's no kind of moral high ground there.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good point about the stigma of the person under the bridge versus the person drinking out of a fancy wine glass. And yeah, I've been following that news with a lot of sadness that I keep reading those articles about the health effects of alcohol, and I enjoy moderate wine especially, and I'm trying to just keep that in check. But I bought into that, a glass of wine with dinner is good for you. It's like, well,
yeah, I feel for you. I also think we want to be careful, because probably chocolate cake isn't good for you, and oversleeping isn't good for you, and staying up late listening to concerts, and we make choices. It's not that we have to treat ourselves like a petri dish. So I think less is better than more, but it's not the case, at any rate, that anybody is really Well, I think you'd have to wonder whether the costs are outweighing the benefits. And I think that's the key point. For some of us, it's really obvious, but it's hard to draw the line there. And so it really does take each person kind of looking at themselves, honestly, which is, as you know, and I know, hard to do.
Yeah, we had an episode back in January with Amanda White, who has a book called Not Drinking Tonight. And she's like, take a look at how is alcohol working in your life. And so if you're questioning the role of alcohol in your life, take a listen to that, because I think that she kind of highlights that idea of, how's it working for you? And you don't have to necessarily meet some sort of criteria for alcohol abuse or alcoholism, whatever that means, for it to be something that's not really functioning well for you personally in your life.
And I think that's true with all drugs. It's true with cannabis now. At first it seems perfect, but there's no perfect drug. And so there's consequences. And in the long run, it takes a good hard look.
So let's talk a little bit about the neuroscience and what's going on with the brain when it comes to addiction. And in the book, you go into a lot of the specifics around some of the different drugs. And so we probably will have to nutshell this a little bit because there's so much information and it's really fascinating in your book. But I wonder if we could start with some of the more general concepts of how addiction works with addictive substances, just in terms of, the reward centers of the brain and dopamine and that kind of thing. I wonder if you could give us kind of like a high level, like nutshell of what's going on there. I know it's probably overly simplistic, but.
No, I think it's good to do the nutshell because otherwise it's hard to remember all the details. So I'd say there are two really key concepts. One is that every addictive drug is a drug that releases dopamine in a particular circuit called the mesolimbic dopamine circuit. And this is a small group of neurons that used to be called kind of the pleasure circuit, and certainly activating or releasing dopamine in this circuit is pleasurable, but it's kind of a lot more than that. It's a circuit that tells us when something is important or valuable or meaningful. So it's kind of the aha, what's that? And it could be something pleasurable like foreplay or chocolate or a little bit of wine, or it could be something dangerous, like, aha, what's that? I'm worried. So it just tells us when it's time to kind of wake up and pay attention. And in a way, then you could say it's signaling meaning. It's signaling that something is important. And that I think is very compelling for young people, especially. So that's kind of what I was getting at earlier. But the second principle, and the one that's really driving addiction, is this one of equilibrium or homeostasis. And that is that the brain is very adaptive. That's why the brain is the brain. So, and not say bone. I mean, bone can change, but the brain is just a master at responding and adjusting itself to experiences, which is how we develop a personality or memories or, a life for that matter. So what happens is, in order to notice something that's important, it's really key to have a baseline of just normal. In other words, if everything was really meaningful, then nothing would matter because you couldn't kind of sort. So what we need is kind of a baseline or a level field upon which something important occurs. So the brain imposes that baseline. It makes sure that it's almost like a pond that's still. So it makes sure the pond stays still. The pond is your brain activity, so that if a stone gets dropped in, you can tell. And it's critical to tell, because if we don't know if something important happens, we'll die, right? If we don't notice a potential mate, we won't procreate. If we don't notice potential danger, we'll get eaten. So for the sake of survival, so therefore for the sake of evolutionary fitness, we need to know if something important happens. Okay, so the brain imposes that level field, And when we take drugs, we think, I did anyway, oh my gosh, I found a way around this. Anything uncomfortable, anything unpleasant, anything damn boring, I could just fix with a little medicine here. But the brain doesn't go for that. So it counteracts it. And the bottom line is it's kind of like a seesaw. Anything that makes us feel better than our normal neutral self, the brain counteracts to make us even. And so, for instance, if you take a stimulant to boost your activity, your brain will produce lethargy and kind of a lack of arousal. If you take a drug that blocks pain, your brain will produce pain. If you take a drug that makes you relax, the brain produces anxiety and tension. Whatever you take a drug to do, and with addictive drugs, we take them to create a sense of meaning, the brain produces the exact opposite effect. And so that the net effect is neutral. And that's why we get tolerant. So the drug doesn't work so well because the brain is counteracting it. That's why we're dependent, because when we take the drug away, we've got this lower baseline now to kind of keep things even. And that's why we crave drugs and go to any length and pay a high price, sometimes with our lives, because of tolerance and dependence. So we're trying to feel normal. And for people who are regular users of any addictive drug, or any drug that affects the brain, actually, but the talk here is about addiction. For any of those people, they can only feel normal with the drug on their brain. And so they're kind of, enslaved by that. So they have to keep the drug there. And, if you talk to somebody who's a regular weed smoker, let's say, they're not really laughing hilariously like they used to, or really enjoying the rich thing of everything. They just feel like without the drug, things are kind of beyond bland and bleak and uninteresting and uninspiring. So the short way to say this is that there's no free lunch. So if you take any drug to feel better than normal on a regular basis, it'll work less and less well, so that you need the drug just to feel normal.
Yeah, as a clinician myself and a therapist, I guess I want to highlight that. I think that's really important what you're saying for when people are trying to cut back or quit, that they get to the point with enough use, enough repeated exposure, you need it just to feel normal, which makes the cravings, the urges to use, the withdrawal effects just so painful and difficult for people.
Yes, that's exactly right. And because those changes are due to the brain adapting, and the brain is so good at adapting, it will get better over time. But for many people, that initial period is so bleak and unpleasant. And, we could say that it's because every single addictive drug makes us feel kind of better than normal. You're going to go through a period of feeling not as well as normal. And the longer you've used, the more you've used, the more potent the drugs are like they are today, then that trough or that little dip can be insurmountable in a way. But I think the big message is that there is sort of these diminishing returns, because you're really spending this money or this time or suffering these consequences only to get, not quite high enough. And that is really unfortunate. Yeah, it's really unfortunate. It kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about what being sober is like, because I think in the beginning, it just did not seem like what I wanted. I really felt, and like other people, that if I didn't try it, I would die. But this was not much better than death, it didn't seem like. So that's why, I went into science, because I thought, I'll fix this and then I'll be able to use and I won't self-destruct.
Well, could you talk about that moment? Because actually your book title, Never Enough, is based, I think, on that moment when you decided to make a change. And that story, I think, was a really powerful one for you, that you ended up doing this clearly meaningful work. But it was I'm sure it was a really difficult road to go from where you were to where you are now. What was the motivation for you behind deciding to make that change?
Yeah, so After that first drink, I took as many drugs as I could get my hands on. I don't know why. I really was kind of dying. I was physically impaired. I had hepatitis from sharing dirty needles. I was right at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, and I could have had HIV. I guess I couldn't get high, really. So drugs were the very thing that made life worth living was killing me. So I was kind of in that terrible trap. And I didn't have the insight. I knew I was trapped, but I thought, well, maybe this next bag of whatever it is will get me out of that for a moment. So I went to treatment, and this was in the 80s. I feel so lucky because I had no idea what treatment was. I honestly thought it was going to be like a spa. I didn't know exactly like a spa, but I thought, it sounds good and I need a break. So I got there, and I quickly saw, people were wearing nurses' uniforms and nobody was having any fun at all. And I realized, wow, I'm screwed now. And I was also about 2,000 miles from home in South Florida. So I don't know. This is just how I am. And I think a lot of us are this way. I figured, okay, I'm going to get through this, whatever I have to do. This is kind of how I survived, partly on the streets. I'm going to just do what I need to do to get through this. And when they said, you're going to die if you keep using, I had just turned 23. So you have to be abstinent. I thought, no, there's going to be another way. There's always some tricky back door, and I'm so smart, I'll figure it out. Anyway, so my back door, and this is like, what the heck? I did have a tendency to like biology all along. I was kind of a mechanism person, so I figured, okay, they think I'm dying, and it's obvious now that I look at it a little bit without any big drugs that things are going well, so I'm going to fix it. It was a very immature and very arrogant view. I mean, I just thought, don't tell me I can't use. I'm going to cure it, and then I'll be able to use. So I feel so grateful because I had this time. I went to a halfway house, which was just miserable. So I was, 4 months of intense supervision, let's say. And I'm doing that only because I'm going to fix it. I felt miserable the whole time. I hated pretty much every second of that. I was gritting my teeth. But I started to feel better. The drugs weren't there, so that equilibrium came back ever so slightly. And I had this goal to become a neuroscientist. And it is really interesting to do science. Just like it's interesting probably to build houses or rocket ships or be an artist or a musician. So I had given all those kind of interests up because my sole interest was getting wasted. But as they started to come back, I kind of threw myself and my little addictive personality, as we said, into research. And it was a lot like cocaine in a way because it was unreliable and challenging and frustrating and sometimes very exciting. And I had given myself 7 years. I don't know why, just I'm this way. So I can do anything, I think, for a short amount of time. So I said, I'm going to take 7 years, I'm going to solve it. Well, 7 years came, and by then I was toward the end of my graduate school. And I thought, my life is a trillion times better. And this is kind of interesting, this science. So I'm going to keep going. And I do want to say it's not in a way that it's a substitute for the quick fix of drugs. Like, let's not gloss over how it is to be showing up all the time, whether you like it or not. My big escape is a movie or bathtub. But on the other hand, it's definitely more interesting. And science is a big part of that for me.
Yeah. And I wonder, I don't know if you would agree with this, but there was something really meaningful to you in your life. You had this curiosity about the science behind this and plunged into the work of doing it. And I'm sure that was really hard at times, but would you agree that having something meaningful maybe helped it feel worth it to go through all that? Because I'm sure it was very, very difficult.
At the time, I don't know that it felt meaningful to me. When I look back on it now, I certainly see it that way. And I think that the reason the first drink was so important in my life is because it substituted for the meaningful feeling. It gave me this sense of purpose in a way and expectation. So I didn't really see it that way, but I am curious. And I also did what anybody who stays sober a long time does, is I kind of just do it a little at a time. I didn't imagine that I would even want to live to this ripe age, or be clean for 30 some years. And I didn't think, I have a new sense of meaning. It's just as good as shooting Coke. No, that wasn't quite it. I think, it was a gradual thing. And some days, an experiment would work and I would think, wow, this is like shooting Coke. And many days it wouldn't be like that. And I would just drag myself through. But I think during that time, my brain was healing and probably still is. And I found that the trade-offs were worth it.
Yeah. Well, generally speaking, one thing we know is that substance abuse disorders are pretty treatment resistant, right? I would say a lot of people try to heal and recover from substance abuse and really struggle to. I guess I'm wondering, so you did it and it took time and I'm sure it was really hard. Do you have any tips or thoughts about what might help someone be more likely to recover? I'm imagining a listener who has maybe a family member that they love or someone they care about, or even someone who themselves struggles with addiction. Is there anything that helps people be more likely to recover?
Well, certainly support does. And support, I think, in my story, was reflected in the fact that I had a place to go with professionals. I didn't have to worry about paying rent. I had a kind of an easy road in a way. It wasn't easy, but it was very well supported. And I think also, you said it earlier, but my curiosity. I had this innate just wondering, what would it be like? And I imagine if you're listening to this, you'd think, is it true that life is not bad without drugs? Because you could never have told me that, but I'm saying it now. It's absolutely 1,000, much, much better. But the third thing really for me, I think, was getting to treatment early. So just like the tendency for addiction is stronger when young people are using, it's also helpful to get support and be curious when you're young. You're naturally more curious, is because the brain is quicker. So I think the fact that I was kind of able to what looks like bounce back is partly that. There's always time, it's possible to heal anywhere. So I guess my hope would be that people would just be curious. And sometimes I say to young people, my own children even, if you can just hold off and see if you can do something meaningful aside from drugs while you're in this precious plastic phase of brain development, then you might not find drugs so reinforcing, and you also might not need them. And if you do use them, you might be able to use without falling off the deep end.
What do you think are some of the hardest, of all the drugs out there, what do you think are some of the hardest ones for people to quit? Because I feel like there's some variation there. And maybe it varies person to person a little bit, but I think some are especially treatment resistant.
Yeah, well, the stimulants are the hardest, notoriously. So methamphetamine and cocaine are the hardest. And that's because of the way specifically that they act on the brain and what they do to the brain. So by driving the meaningful or pleasurable pathway, that mesolimbic dopamine pathway, so hard and effectively, it kind of gets numb. And in some ways, maybe permanently numb. Now, there's always healing, but perhaps not all the way. And my husband, so he'll laugh at me because he says, you are never satisfied still. And, he's talking about, do I need another house, or do I need another vacation, or do I need another color on the wall? I mean, I'm just kind of constantly wanting to do new things. And that, I think, may be from those drugs. The other thing about those drugs is a lot of times people will get clean and then they are for a while, maybe even a few weeks, but then they're susceptible to relapse because things seem so uninspired and bland. Whereas for, say, alcohol or opiates, the hardest time, or nicotine, the hardest time is at the beginning. So these are a little
Yeah.
insidious that way. But I'd say opioids, if you have a lot of support and maybe some medication assisted therapy, you can recover really thoroughly. Your brain is not really damaged. So they're kind of on the other end. Alcohol is probably somewhere in the middle.
That makes a lot of sense if you think about it behaviorally, that, something like even heroin, it's very, very terrible and uncomfortable when you're first going off of it. But if you can make it through that, then the cravings, the withdrawal effects will subside. But with some of the stimulants, that dopamine hit is so reinforcing. And it, like you said, it kind of doesn't go away. You make it through the withdrawal period and you're still having the urges and the cravings. Is that right?
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, one of the concepts from your book that I think will absolutely stay with me is this idea that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's freedom, or just having the choice to make a decision. Oh, wow. I think that is so interesting to think about it that way. Could you say a little bit more about that? Like, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, it's funny. The word addiction comes from this Latin term for slave. And so it was really originally for gamblers. And the idea was that if you owed somebody money because you lost, like people like me kind of lost, then you were made the property of the person you owed to. And so I think this really fits because I think by getting all the good feelings I could get as quickly and as, massively as I could manage with all the chemicals, I was kind of having a debt to this counteracting state. So my brain was busy adapting to all that. And so then when I took those away, I felt terrible. So it is kind of like being a slave. And that obviously is the opposite of being free. And so, that's one of the many ironies, but I loved being able to do exactly what I wanted to do when I wanted to do it and how I wanted to do it, and nobody could really get in my way. But on the other hand, I was subject to my feeling states. Like I just had to constantly be worried about where am I going to get the next whatever. So what I thought at the beginning was I have to get through this and then I just got to trudge through my life, sober. I mean, is it even worth living like that? On the other hand, I realized, oh my gosh, it's so much more wide open. And I remember this is a silly example, but I was probably 2 or 3 years clean and I realized I can do whatever I want. I'm not going to brush my teeth. I don't have to. And I guess I fiercely defend my consciousness and my opportunity to choose how I'm going to respond, what I'm going to do, where I'm going to go. It is kind of the best gift of being a human being, I think.
Maybe that's a good way to define addiction, because I know that there's the definition's always changing, the terminology is always changing. But when it gets to that point, you tell some stories in the book, people are so driven to acquire their next, whatever it is, their next hit of something or whatever, that they really lose control of their behavior, of their lives, everything. It just becomes this automatic drive for people. Maybe that's where it's at the point that it doesn't feel like a free choice that you're making anymore. It feels like you're out of control in terms of being able to make a choice.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely there's no choice. It is automatic. And automatic is such a kind of industrial, terrible thought. I mean, who wants their lives to be automatic? Here we're going for these high peaks, and what we end up doing is just like a machine, pushing the button, pushing the button, pushing the button. So I definitely think that's a good way to look at it.
And behaviorally, I mean, I keep tying this back to my field of behavioral psychology. And it's like, we want to help people. If we're working with addiction, we want to help people be able to pause in those moments and make a more intentional and conscious choice. And it's not always easy to do that when people are so driven by that automaticity, but that's really where the freedom lies, is just being able to pause in that moment and make a more intentional, conscious decision.
Yeah, well, it's important, I think, to bring the neuroscience back in here, because what happens with regular use, just like with any kind of habit, is it becomes automatic. So if you drive home a certain way every day, you don't even have to think about it. And in order to go a different way, you really have to think about it. So let's say you were supposed to stop somewhere new, it takes effort. So I know what happens is in the beginning, people pick up because, oh, this seems like it could be interesting, usually, or fun or something new. And usually within kind of short order, subcortical habit and even compulsive structures take over. And so the difference between a habit, which is just kind of an automatic behavior, and a compulsion is that compulsions have this sense of negative urgency, like I must do it because otherwise I'm miserable. And so you have a habit with a must doing it. And there's really not much choice in that. There really isn't. I mean, you could say, if someone is holding a gun to your head, would you stop? And the answer's got to be no, because look, people are having guns held to their head. It might not be a revolver. I just have a friend who recently died of liver failure, which is terrible. She was in her 40s. She had 2 kids, and that was a gun, but she couldn't stop drinking. We lose everything we care about, including ourselves. So yeah, no, I think it's really important to recognize that the people we know and love who are suffering with substance use disorders have very little choice. And that's why the support and the time is so critical, because it's not like, a pat on the back is going to help. It's really not.
Well, that's a good segue to the final thing I wanted to ask you about today, which is, I think, just about the level of all the addiction happening in the world around us here in the United States, but also other places around the world. And I think in the aftermath of COVID, it's, certainly escalated even more. Clearly, the war on drugs approach was not successful. Do you have any ideas that you really stand by in terms of what we should be doing as a society?
Yes, I do. Of course. I have 2 ideas. One is just that we should recognize that it is a hard time to be alive. I just saw a report that said 27% of adults in the US are so anxious that they have a hard time functioning. More than 1 in 4 adults feel like they can't function because they're so anxious. So this is not just a few people. This is your neighbors, if it's not yourself. So let's just all say, I don't care what the commercials are showing, things are rough. It's hard. It is dang hard. So that, I think, is the kind of the first step, that what we're doing isn't really working. And that's true kind of for all of us, or for many, many, many of us. And then the second thing, and the reason I think that's important, I guess, is because I think if we can't tell the truth to ourselves, then we're hopeless. The second thing is that imagine how this is for kids. And I hate to focus on this so much, but I feel bad for the adults, but we kind of made our lives. But kids right now, seeing, they know that this many people are anxious and depressed and things aren't going well. And what they also know is that there's a lot of opportunity to take drugs to mitigate those feelings. The climate's getting warmer, their neighbors are getting more and more stressed. What do? So we have to show up for each other and for especially young people. And I think that is a messy, there's no good way to do it. I can just say this from my own experience. It was not pretty. It is not pretty often. It's not graceful. It's just that I try. I do the best I can. And I don't, because I couldn't escape without self-destructing, I found other ways. And one of the things that I think is really useful that I used myself is my first response to pain or anxiety or sadness is to kind of withdraw, to just go away, and drugs help with that. And instead, I use my freedom to do the very hard thing of talking to someone else, of telling the truth. The day actually sucks. I'm not doing well. I got this rejection or whatever. And so that, and then having people around us and being there for each other. If you know how to do this and you're listening, help your neighbors and your neighbors' children, because there's not a lot of models, I can say. What is the model? The model's to go watch TV or drink the box of wine or take a little extra of this. So I think we need to tell the truth. It's not going well. I think it's going to be hard, but I think this is the time.
These are themes that come up often on our podcast, I think, around acknowledging how hard things are, being open to those painful feelings and supporting each other, talking to each other more openly and giving each other that support. So I actually think that was a very beautiful note to end on and very consistent with how we talk about these things on the podcast, right? I think you're really talking about a much higher level change. There's probably all kinds of policies and things like that about drugs, but it's really more about like the underlying problems that are contributing to the people using in the first place.
Yeah, I was going to tell this one quick story because my youngest child is 20. And during the difficult time for me and for her, because my natural tendency is to escape, she would want to go into her room and close the door, and I would want to go into my room and close the door. And that just seems easier, doesn't it? Just to go into our own room and close the door in one way or another. And I got this advice from a friend because I'm naturally a door closer. And I would say to my daughter, we're just going to sit on the couch together. You don't have to talk to me. And I'm not going to lecture you. And we would just sit there. And, she would be scowling and rolling her eyes and scrolling through her phone. And I would be, just trying to be still and maybe scrolling through my phone. But every once in a while, she would say something like, "You wouldn't believe what happened at school today." Or, "What do you think of this TikTok thing?" So I think just being there with each other gave that opportunity for like the thinnest bridge to connection. And so I think that is the thing we can do. We can knock on the door. We can put out our hand. We can look somebody in the eye. We can tell them how it is for us. And, it's not easy.
That's so beautiful. Just picturing the two of you on the couch. It made me tear up a little. It's so sweet. Yeah, love that. Well, what do you have ahead? It sounds like you might be working on another project.
Yes, well, I've got two big ideas. The first one is a book for people who don't really have a problem. And I'm calling it Why Not Use Drugs? And I think that we have many opportunities today, more than ever in our history, even though drug use is really normal and in some ways has been good for human beings, for our evolution and our cultural development. But what's new is that we have access to so many things. So I'm just writing this book, hopefully, to help people pause and think about their choices, their freedom, and how drugs or their use can best serve their lives. And I think that's good for all of us, wherever we are. And there are certain pieces of information about that I think would be helpful. And then the second one is specifically on kids and cannabis, that even though I used everything I could find, cannabis was definitely my favorite of all drugs. And it is for many young people today. And I think that there's a lot of confusion about how it intersects with brain development and behavioral development and, growing up, that I would like to help shed light on.
Wow. Well, keep us posted on those books. We would love to have you back down the road to talk about them if you're up for it.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, let me just remind listeners of your book. It's, again, the one that we're talking about today is Never Enough, The Neuroscience and Experience of Addiction. Highly recommend. And we'll also link to your website on our show notes for today. And I know you have a TED Talk and some other resources available online so that people can find out more.
That's great. And they should feel free to write to me at Bucknell University if they have questions about the book or the talk or something. I'd be glad to connect.
Oh, awesome. Thank you for offering that. That's great. So connect with Judy if you'd like to. And Judy, thank you so much. I really appreciate you talking with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our strategic consultant, Michael Harold, and our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're having a mental health emergency, dial 911. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.